Turning fat into muscle is a concept pushed heavily in the fitness media without too much pushback. The specific origin of it is unknown, and maybe it's just more of a figurative way to describe getting fit, but misinterpreted for literal truth. Whatever the case, the belief runs rampant in the industry today. So let's just cut straight to the chase. No, you cannot turn fat into muscle. Fat and muscle are completely different muscle tissues, with fats being made up of something you probably heard of from your biology class, triglycerides. Muscle, on the other hand, is comprised of myofibrils, with each rod-like cell housing different proteins such as actin and myosin, among other molecules such as nitrogen, allowing the muscle to produce force. In short, fat and muscle are wildly different tissues and do not have the capability of being directly converted from one to the other. But often this claim of swapping your fat for muscle brings about another important question. Is it even possible to burn fat and muscle at the same time? Ideally, focusing on one or the other at a time is better, as they're optimized by completely opposite states. Burning fat is advantageous in a catabolic state via a calorie deficit by consuming fewer calories than you burn, shifting to fat as a predominant energy source. Building muscle is optimized in an anabolic state, consuming more calories than you burn, especially protein. Paired with resistance training, the body signals muscle protein synthesis and produces new muscle tissue. Based on this, it certainly looks implausible to burn fat and muscle at the same time. Fortunately, it can be done, but it takes a more judicious effort to do than to do them separately. According to Science.net, in their compiled study review, scientific research suggests that the best potential case to build muscle during a calorie deficit is if you're overweight and or have very little exercise experience. So it's hypothesized by some, including myself, that one, by carrying more body fat, your body has a larger energy reservoir to attenuate muscle breakdown, and two, untrained individuals have a greater genetic growth potential where even the slightest form of exercise can induce muscle growth. Such a scenario might create the illusion of one converting their fat into muscle, but it's more because one is burning fat and then building muscle in its place. A slight but important difference. However, this is much more difficult for lean and trained athletes to achieve, since the exact opposite is true for them. Also, results will be slower, so temper your expectations. Perhaps the best strategy to implement, and where the added effort is required, is to use a modest calorie deficit, maybe no more than 300 to 400 calories or so, and keeping your protein high, hovering within 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight range or more. Trained and lean individuals will require a much more stringent calorie deficit with more protein. But most importantly is resistance training. Without some form of resistance exercise, regardless of a deficit or surplus, no muscle will be built. Also, some might find use in programs that take advantage of carb cycling, which rotates days of eating at a deficit with days eating at a surplus by adding more carbs. Ultimately, no, you cannot turn fat into muscle, but yes, you can burn fat and build muscle at the same time under the right circumstances. Range of motion is defined as the distance that a weight travels or the degree of angle a joint moves. Range of motion, or ROM, is a variable we need to consider when learning strength training. When we shorten the ROM, we're able to do more repetitions of a heavier load of an exercise before we fatigue. As a general rule of thumb, the more ROM we achieve, the more a muscle is stimulated, and therefore the better results we can get for a movement. So we should almost always attempt to achieve the biggest range of motion as possible to stimulate the muscle as best we can. There are a few exceptions to this rule, number one being injury, and number two, if increasing the range of motion takes tension off the muscle, we should limit the ROM to maintain the tension on the muscle we're trying to work. ROM is particularly helpful in the stretch phase of an exercise, as the muscle is most activated when we stretch it, so we should always aim to stretch the muscle as much as we can. There are some examples of exercise such as partial reps, which I do implement occasionally, but as a general rule, more ROM is better. Here are some examples of full ROM versus
Here's some examples I've found on the internet about full range versus partial range. Now we're going to have a look at this video here. In this video, he shows some examples of a partial range of motion. Okay, that's the partial range of motion. You can see the joint angle there. It's moving, the bar's moving maybe 25 centimeters. And if we take a look at this video, there we go, see, you can see the bar travels a much bigger distance. You can see, let's go to the bottom. So what will happen in this example is at the bottom, the target muscle gets stretched, and the muscle, therefore, the muscle activation will be greater. And you'll see that you'll see a lot of videos online when people are discussing partial range of motion. And there is merit to it, but for the sake of this program, for the sake of simplicity, we are looking for full range of motion. And the second example I'll show you is the squat. Squat's an interesting one because there are a lot of complicated movements. And the squat that you mostly hear about, the safest squat, will be just below parallel, cool. And then you compare that to the ultra deep squat. So the benefit of the deep squat in the squat pattern is that at the bottom the glutes get stretched, therefore there's more activation in the muscle, and the science does support greater muscle growth when you go deeper in the squat. And because it's a compound movement, there's multiple muscles moving, and you can see that at the knee joint, the angle is not hugely different between parallel and ultra deep. Therefore, the muscle activation of the quads would be the same if you were doing a partial rep compared to if you're going deep, but the glute activation is much greater. So with the squat, there are some very good reasons not to go deep in the squat. Number one is injury, and it's not to say that the deep squat is more dangerous for any particular person. It really does depend on the individual. Whether you've had a previous knee injury, that can be a reason not to deep squat. And if you lack the mobility to go deep, then if you're not mobile enough to achieve a deep squat, then there will be some issues, some extra pressure on the back, extra pressure on the knees, or whatever. So they're the two versions of the squat I'd like to show you.
So to summarise, full ROM is always better as long as it's pain-free and safe.